صباح الخير جميعا. أنا اسمي سامر عطلة، أنا أستاذ مساعد بقسم الاقتصاد بالجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة ورئيس وحدة الأبحاث بمشروع سياسات بديلة. أحب أبدأ بشكركم وترحيب بيكم في المؤتمر السنوي الأول للمشروع. وقبل ما أبدأ الجلسة هطلب من حضراتكم التفضل بإغلاق أصوات التليفونات المحمولة حتى لا تتسبب في انقطاع الحديث للمتحدثين. السادة المشاركين في هذه الجلسة يتحدثون باللغة الإنجليزية. هناك ترجمة فورية من الإنجليزية إلى العربية. دي أول جلسة في المؤتمر تحت عنوان توزيع الدخول واللامساواة في الفرص. هيتشرفنا بالحديث السادة الضيوف دكتور فرانسيسكو باستوري، أستاذ مساعد بجامعة كامبانيا جامعة نابولي الثانية سابقا، وعضو المجلس التنفيذي للجمعية الأوروبية للدراسات المقارنة، وهو في الحقيقة متخصص في دراسات اقتصادات العمل والتعليم، ومهتم أيضا بالاقتصاديات الدول النامية والانتقالية زي الحالة المصرية. وأيضا يشرفني جدا أني أرحب بالدكتورة دينا مجدي أرمانيوس، أستاذة الإحصاء بكلية الاقتصاد والعلوم السياسية بجامعة القاهرة، وهي عندها خبرة طويلة في مجال تحليل بيانات مساحات الأسرة وتقييم الأمان الغذائي وتحليل الفقر والدخل متعدد الأبعاد في الدول العربية. وشاركت في تقارير كتير عن الفقر واللامساواة. فهي السادة المتحدثين النهارده هيضيفوا لنا في محاولة معرفتنا وتحليلنا لعدم تكافؤ الفرص واللامساواة من خلال البيانات اللي بتجيلنا من مساحات الأسر والبيانات التحليلية اللي بتجيلنا من هذه المساحات. هنبدأ الجلسة بالدكتور فرانسيسكو باستوري. لكل متحدث هيكون في 20 دقيقة للتحدث بتاعه، وبعدين هيبقى في فترة للحضور لطرح الأسئلة. أجين المرة الثانية بطلب من الحضور لو سمحتم مشكورين التفضل بإغلاق أصوات الهواتف المحمولة حتى نتم الجلسة بدون أي مقاطعة. شكرا جزيلا. Dr. Francisco, I would like to welcome you again to the American University in Cairo and to Alternative Policy Solution. You have 20 minutes to start your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk at this conference. I'm very pleased to be here. Also, I took this occasion to prepare my paper on intergenerational mobility in Egypt and Jordan, two MENA countries, and I called the paper "Getting Stuck in the Status Quo Ante" because these are countries where mobility is very low, and social mobility is very important, especially across generations, because it's conditioned for economic growth. So when we have a structural change which is coming about with growth, you need people to move from one types of occupation to others. And therefore it is important that society is mobile enough to accommodate these changes in the economic production, in the production structure. And in fact, the main motivation of this paper was exactly this, to understand whether there is any kind of factor that is going to stop or to get the country stuck into the status quo ante, because if some young people are stuck into in the occupation of their parents, probably also the economy is going to be stuck into the past structure of production. And we look at this by looking not only at male son and fathers, but also mothers and daughters. We study the correlation between the probability to be in some occupation by fathers and mothers, and the same probability to be in that occupation by daughters and sons. And also we try to look at the upper mobility in terms of probability to find a better job for people in agricultural sector or in the blue-collar jobs, to get to middle class or apical positions in white-collar jobs. And we also have some policy implications. We look at the factors that might help people to increase their intergenerational mobility. And I'll elaborate a little bit more in this, on this point at the end of my presentation. Here we just could say that especially for individuals coming from agriculture, young people, and especially women coming from agriculture and blue-collar jobs, reaching the apical positions and white-collar jobs is a matter also of education and of getting the right skills. So, and in this case, we can find some problems in generating this kind of skills if the primary education, primary school and low secondary school do not help young people develop soft skills, which are due also to social interaction within the class, and to the high-level schools, higher education, to provide not only general education, competencies which are related to general education, but also work-related skills which are important to reach better jobs, and which individuals with the poor family background cannot get within the family. So they need to get it through interaction with the world of work. And schools, educational institutions should contribute also to this. And in fact, it's now a quite well-known fact that social mobility is an important factor to explain economic growth and structural change, but in the MENA context, there is not much empirical evidence. We just know from anecdotal evidence that there is very low social mobility. And I think that our contribution in this paper is to provide more evidence that was not available until now. As far as I know, there is only very little literature on these two countries that we study. We use the same data as Professor Assad, and therefore we are able to compare the situation across 20 years in the case of Egypt and also 6 years in the case of Jordan. So this is quite interesting, I think, also for the more general literature, which is generally focusing on a very short period of time. So here thanks to this data, we can compare situations in very different periods, historical periods. And the evidence, therefore, that we provide is interesting also probably for, we cover countries that are not much covered in the literature, but also because of some methodological novelty that we try to introduce in this paper. We use a methodology, propensity score matching, that nowadays is becoming quite popular. But I think, as far as I know, it's never been used in this field of intergenerational mobility. So this is something new, I guess, because we look at the occupation of fathers as treatment, and occupation of children or son as the outcome variable. And we define a treatment group as people whose father was working in agriculture. And then we study the probability of these people to find a job in the blue collar, as a blue collar occupation or a white collar job. And we take as control groups individuals which have who have as parents people with a blue-collar or white-collar job. So we can compare individuals across occupations, fathers and sons, or mothers and daughters. And we do this covering, as I said before, countries where, as was masterly explained by Professor Assad, as a particular economic situation, because I found very strong complementarity between my presentation and the previous presentations, especially one by Professor Assad, because we find, as we'll see in a while, that some results are quite peculiar. For instance, the probability to get a blue-collar job is much lower than getting a white-collar job. And this is probably due to the factors that were explained before by the peculiar structure, economic structure of Egypt, which is mainly generating jobs, creating jobs in the service sector rather than in the manufacturing sector, and probably also in the public sector rather than in the industrial sector. Actually, we saw that manufacturing jobs are reducing, and this may probably explain also the data and the finding that we find in this paper. Actually, we found very little literature about these countries, and also conclusions are sometimes inconsistent, or at least apparently inconsistent, probably also because they look at different periods in time. So we have only few papers that we could find, and some of them find in the 80s or in the 70s high degree of social mobility. Probably at that time it was true, but then later papers found that the social mobility in Egypt, especially in Egypt, is very, very low. And only a few other papers look at this occupational or educational mobility, and always they find in recent years very low social mobility, okay? So actually we also find similar results, especially with the last papers available, but with some specification that I will show. Propensity score matching is new in this literature. I don't want to go too much into technical details, but just to say that it is a kind of quasi-experimental methodology, and is developed in 2 steps. Step 1, you estimate the probability model of the probability that the father is involved in an agricultural job, which is our treatment. And we do this in terms of number of control variables that are available in our data, so age, rural area, livelihood, and literacy status of the father. And then based on this, we draw a casual control group from people in with the father in having a blue-collar or a white-collar job. And then at step 2, we simply do we calculate the ET of the probability of an individual whose father was employed in agriculture to find a blue or a white-collar job. What is the importance of this methodology? The importance of this methodology is that it is able to control for omitted heterogeneity and sample selection bias. So you get 2 samples for each group, target and the control group, which are exactly the same. So have exactly the same characteristics, at least the observable characteristics that we can measure in our data. And this will reduce all sources of bias due to these observable characteristics, observable differences in the characteristics. And then we use standard errors. We measure standard errors by bootstrapping, because first step standard errors are downward biased if they are used in the second step. So it's just a technical point to get better standard errors. And these are the main results. For Egypt, we compare different years. We find that actually people coming from the agricultural sector whose father is involved in agriculture have a much lower probability to find a blue or a white-collar job. This is from 5% in 1998, and then it goes up to 9% in 2012 and 2018. So this is clear evidence of the low social mobility, especially for individuals coming from the agricultural sector to reach more or better jobs in the blue-collar sector. And we do the same for with disentangled blue and white-collar jobs. This was just for any kind of blue or white collar. When we go into details and we look at the probability of somebody having a father in agriculture to get a blue-collar job, we see that most of the impact it comes from this group. So it is especially difficult in Egypt to get to a blue-collar job, so in the manufacturing sector, which is in line with what was already found by Professor Assad, that manufacturing jobs are declining, and therefore it is very difficult. So in a way, this evidence seems to line towards the idea that what is missing in search of this middle level or middle class in Egypt is more the manufacturing sector, the sector of blue-collar jobs, which are actually probably providing also quite good jobs and in the formal sector. So probably this is what is missing the most in this social mobility. So we have, in fact, that most of the effect is coming from movement towards blue-collar jobs, whereas movements to white-collar jobs are only recently becoming negative, whereas in the past it was much easier to get to white-collar jobs apparently rather than to blue-collar jobs, which is quite surprising from my point of view. But actually, after listening to the previous presentation, it makes sense because it's the structure of the economy that is mainly towards the public sector, probably the employment in the white-collar jobs in public sector, rather than manufacturing sector. So blue-collar jobs are much on demand in the economy. And when we look at the gender differences, we see that most of this is for men, of course. So it's especially men that have a big problem in finding, in moving up the ladder, social ladder from agricultural jobs to blue-collar jobs. And this is even 20% less the probability to find a blue-collar job for somebody from a man whose father was in agriculture in 2012, and still minus 13% the probability to find a job in the blue-collar sector for a person coming from agriculture, for a man coming from agriculture. Whereas if we look at white-collar jobs, there is no this effect. Also for agricultural people, it's not difficult to get a job in a white-collar job, whereas it's more difficult to get a blue-collar job. I think it's quite surprising in my view, this result. And this is also true for women, but women also do not find, are less interested in blue-collar jobs, so they have more or less the same chances to get a blue or white-collar job. So this is especially an effect of manufacturing and of men rather than women in the case of Egypt. And also I found it quite surprising that I found only a small impact of the probability to reach apical position for individuals whose father was in agriculture. Although we still have, of course, a negative impact on the probability to find an apical position, so a managerial position for somebody whose father was involved in agriculture. And this is especially for men rather than for women. And regarding Jordan, maybe less interesting for this audience, case of Jordan, but still quite interesting. Just quickly, we can mention that Jordan is apparently, for both genders, there is less an impact of social mobility. So in a way, it's much more mobile, looks much more mobile from this type of indicator. And if there is an impact, again, is on manufacturing sector rather than on white-collar jobs, although in the past it was also for white-collar jobs. And we have also the situation of men and women, again, similar to Egypt, also in Jordan. It's mainly, to summarize my presentation, because there are a lot of more estimates, but to summarize the results, it's mainly a male factor and a male problem in reaching, in getting to manufacturing jobs. And conclusion and policy implications, I would suggest that, policy implications are, as I was mentioning before, social mobility. The only way to increase social mobility is by means of reforming the educational system. And the educational system is at the heart of this kind of problem of mismatch and of social immobility. Of course, there is also a problem of getting the good jobs. I mean, it's essentially also a matter of demand side, of course, but assuming that demand side is developing to help young people to cope with this change, this structural change which is associated with economic development, I think that it is important to develop soft skills at the level of primary and low secondary education, especially for women, for young women, and develop also work-related competencies in high secondary and university education. So this is important that there is more attention to what is called the dual principle in education, which means having at the same time general education, but also work-related skills. And as Becker was explaining in his famous paper, while general education can be learned in the classrooms, instead work-related competencies can be learned only in companies. So it is important also that young people have some work experience, especially young people, because when the social structure is stable, is static, skills are transferred by fathers to children. Whereas when society is changing, is changing the structure, you don't have anymore this parental mechanism of transmission of skills. And then therefore it is important, especially for people that have to experience this kind of change, to have some work-related experience, so develop some work-related competencies through work experience, so within the firm. So I think that educational systems should be much more connected with the world of work and be able to transfer to young people, especially those young people that come from some less developed areas, these kind of skills. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Professor Pastore, for giving us more evidence about the lack of equal opportunity in both the Jordanian and the Egyptian context, and also for underlying the importance of education in ensuring equality of opportunity, particularly, obviously, for young people, whether men or women, and also particularly when the economy undergoes forms of structural transformation, moving away from an agricultural-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. So this is obviously, and it's very relevant, obviously, to the Egyptian case, where a large part of the economy and its employment are employment in the agricultural sector or agriculture-related activities. Thank you so much. Oh, that's not my phone. That's 20 minutes exactly. Thank you. خلاص. I move to my colleague, Dr. Dina Armanious. You need the laptop, so is it going to be okay?
Maybe she should.
Do you want to? Maybe if you can kind enough to shift, yeah, thank you,
Okay.
appreciate it. So. بالنسبة للسادة الحضور، هي دي جلسة فنية شوية، فيها أرقام كتير جدا، فيها تحليلات اقتصادية. طبعا الزملاء الحضور اقتصاديين وبيستخدموا تعبيرات شوية فنية. أنا هحاول بقدر الإمكان إن احنا نركز في للجمهور العام، نركز أكتر في النتائج الرئيسية والاستنتاجات اللي ليها دعوة بالسياسات في النقاش. طبعا انا شايف طبعا في حضور متخصص وعارفين كويس التحليلات اللي احنا بنقدمها، لكن بالنسبه للجمهور عام في النقاش هنركز اكتر على التداعيات للنتائج دي. شكرا. اتفضلي يا دكتوره دينا.
Thanks for coming here, and thank you. I will talk about the inequality of opportunities in food security in Egypt. It's other topic other than the education. So I will talk about the food security. I will talk about the objectives, why of this paper, data and methodology used, which is also different from the other one, the first data. Poverty and adequacy of food consumption, coping strategies for insufficient food consumption in Egypt. I will talk about carry, what this carry of food security, and then I will talk about the main topic, which is inequality of opportunities in food security. For the objective, this paper attempts to provide a brief about the poverty and food security status in Egypt. Of course, we'll talk about 2018. I want also to examine the inequality of opportunities in food security. I will talk also about the carry. What is carry? It is the WFP, this is a WFP approach, which is a consolidated approach for reporting indicators. The carry is like a composite indicator for food security, or examine the food security by this carry. Carry includes 3 indicators, very important indicators. It is a poverty status, it is livelihood coping strategies for insufficient food security, and the last one, which is a caloric deficiency. So we'll talk about the 3 indicators first, and then I will talk how this carry it will be done, and then how this carry measure the food insecurity in Egypt. Accordingly, this is the steps of this paper. I will talk about the adequacy of household food consumption, main coping strategies, caloric deficiency, and carry and inequality of opportunities. The data used in this paper, I used data from EACES, which is a national representative household income, expenditure, and consumption survey. It is carried out by the CAPMAS. I use the latest EACES, which is end by September 2018. Why this EACES used in this paper? Because it includes all data about poverty status, because this is the only survey in Egypt which measured the poverty state. The national poverty rate from Egypt, here in Egypt, is carried out by this EACES. So I used this EACES because the poverty state is included in this EACES, and also there is a module for food security in EACES. Also, I will use an EACES 2015 in order to make some comparisons with 2015. And this EACES, as I mentioned, it includes module for food security. For the methodology, for the income poverty, what I use here in this data, the official poverty lines adopted by CAPMAS. I will not calculate it. This is not wealth index. It is an income poverty. Income poverty depends upon the cost of basic needs, which is calculated by the CAPMAS. And when we say poor, it means those people cannot afford to consume minimum acceptable basic needs. And when we talk about the extreme poor household, extreme poor, it means those people cannot satisfy their basic needs of food, so they are food insecure. For the Human Opportunity Index, which is the main topic in this paper, Human Opportunity Index, what this Human Opportunity Index very clearly, or in summary, it is equality of opportunity based upon the idea of giving people of equal opportunity, equal service. I give all household the same service by equally, whatever the socioeconomic background. This is what we mean by equality of opportunity. But in reality, this has not happened, because the Human Opportunity Index, it means I'm talking about a coverage rate, a global coverage rate, but this coverage rate is subtracted from it the inequality among households. So it gives how much those people have equal opportunity of getting or access to this service. And since I'm talking about food security, so when we talk about Human Opportunity Index about food security, it means it gives how much people they are equal in accessibility to this service or to this food security. Without going on statistics, yes.
No, you can.
It's, the Human Opportunity Index is the global coverage minus the penalty, or penalization. Penalization, it gives 0 if all the rate of coverage across all the groups of circumstances here, it's the characteristics of beneficiaries. If all, it will be 0, and it means all the groups have the same coverage. All groups have the same accessibility. So there is equality between them. And طبعا penalization will grow positive when the coverage between the groups of circumstances also there is an equality, the inequality increase. Accordingly, the Human Opportunity Index would always improve when the inequality decrease or the total coverage increase. This is by, not by going on details, finally, if I'm talking about the Human Opportunity Index, which gives how much the accessibility to the service are equal, if I'm comparing between urban and rural, there is a difference between urban. For example, there is a difference between urban and rural. So when we say the Human Opportunity Index, there is a difference between urban and rural. How we can decompose this difference between the urban and rural. The decomposition of the Human Opportunity Index, we can decompose it into 2 points. What we call it coverage or scale effect, and what we call it distribution effect. Maybe the difference between urban and rural is returned back that due to the changes in the average rate of coverage. Or the other one, which is the distribution effect, maybe return back to the change only to the reduction of inequality of opportunities. So we can decompose the change in the Human Opportunity Index according to the coverage or according to the inequality. The first topic, which is the first component of CARI, and I'm talking here about CARI, which is decomposed into or consists of 3 indicators. The first component of CARI is the income poverty. This is a trend of income poverty from 1999 to 2018. We found that there is a steady increase in income poverty rates in Egypt from 1999 to 2018. 2018, the poverty rate is 32.5%. This means we have 32, almost 1/3 of the population are under the poverty line. They cannot satisfy their basic needs. Over the past 8 years, from 2010 to 2018, poverty increased by 7.3 percentage points, from 25.2% to 32.5%, affecting 32 million of the population. If I'm talking about extreme poverty, it means people cannot afford to consume the basic food needs. So also we found that we have a steady increase in extreme poverty, or in this poverty, from 2012 to 2018. Today, or 2018, we have 6.2% in Egypt. They suffer from food insecurity. They cannot satisfy their basic food needs. 6.2. If I'm comparing by urban rural, of course, as you look at the graph, of course we found that the poverty rates are generally higher in Egypt in rural areas if compared by the urban areas. But between 2015 and 2018, if you look at the urban areas, we found we have a jump in the poverty rate in the urban areas between 2015 and 2018, increased significantly from 16.9 to 24.6. While small increase of poverty experienced by the rural areas, but already all rural areas in all years is higher than the urban. Poverty by regions, also poverty is most profound, of course, in rural Upper Egypt. In 2018, we found that 52%, almost more than half of the population in rural Upper Egypt are poor. They cannot satisfy their basic needs. While they only, their population size is only 1/4 of the total population, but they represent 52% of the whole poverty. For governorate, we found that, of course, which is expected also, governorate of Asyut, Suhag, Al-Qusr, and Minya in Upper Egypt are the poorest across the country. We found that in Asyut in 2018, we have 67% of the population in Asyut are poor. Also in Cairo, there is much, almost 1/3 of population of Cairo, 31% are poor. Poverty rate of all Upper Egypt governorates are higher than the national rate, except for Fayoum. If we look at the change between 2015 and 2018, we found that some governorates, their poverty rate increased, and some other, they decreased. We found that, for example, ENA witnessed the largest decline in the percentage of poor people between 2015 and 2018, a decline by 14.5 percentage points. While the highest increase in the percentage of poor people is found in Bahira, increased by 24% points, followed by Cairo, 14% point between 2015 and 2018. If we look at the second topic, which is adequacy of household food consumption. In HIKE's questionnaire for 2018, we found that there is a question which is household were asked about the adequacy of food consumption during the last 30 days. We found that we have 24.6% of households reported they could barely meet their basic food needs. And we have, above this, we have almost 5% reported insufficient access to food. Accordingly, we have almost 30% does not consume adequate food in the last 30 days. Among the poor population, this percent increased to 41%. 41% among the poor reporting they cannot consume adequate food, while this percentage decreased to 25.6% among the non-poor. By region, we found that percentage of households on the borderline or having insufficient access to food increased between 2015 and 2018 in Lower Egypt and Frontier Governorate. Of course, as expected, always in rural Upper Egypt is the worst, even in the poverty and in food security also, or in food consumption. We found that in the worst region is adequate food consumption is in rural Upper Egypt, where 43.4% of the population in rural Upper Egypt suffer from inadequate consumption of food. Coping strategies, which is very important, which is the second component of carry after the poverty line. Household who reported that they have insufficient access to food or at the borderline, we asked them in HIKE's 2018 how to cope with this, what you do in order to cope with this insufficient food. The coping strategies, because we have many coping strategies, WFP, it's not our, classify the coping strategies into 4 categories. We have what we call it consumption strategies, which is the first one. Consumption strategies such as eating cheaper food or reducing number of portion of meals. We have what we call it stress strategies, borrowing food or borrowing money to buy food. Crisis, which is very crisis really, because such as reducing expenditure on health and education and sending children to work and sell income generating land. And the last one, emergency, it's begging, such as rely on assistance or seek for donation. If we look at the coping strategies for poor access, this is the distribution. Those who are on the borderline or consuming insufficient amount of food. This is a distribution. We found that 40% of households relied on the consumption strategies, eating cheaper food, which is more reliable. That way I'm using cheaper food. 31 adopt emergency begging or seek for donation. 13 depend on crisis, reducing expenditure on health and education. If we look at the coping strategies by regions, this is very important that we have always poor household in general, because will be on general, poor household, or in the rural Upper Egypt, or in rural areas, we always depend on the emergency and crisis strategies. Emergency, it means I'm begging or seek for donation. Crisis strategies, it means I'm decrease the consumption on education and health. Overall, urban areas rely always on consumption strategies. Metropolitan, if I'm talking about governorate or region, metropolitan depend largely on consumption strategies, cheaper food 55%. Upper Egypt depends on stress, borrowing more than other regions. If I compare between 2015 and 2018, here it's not a coping strategy, sorry, this is for caloric intake. Caloric intake, it means, this is a third component of carry. Caloric intake, it means how much calories I take it from our food, which it's an indicator for diversity of this food, or by other word, quality of the food I'm consuming. This is the average per capita daily energy intake. On average, we found that the caloric intake increased from 2015 to 2018. This is for per capita caloric intake. The calorie consumption amounts increased in most Upper and Lower Egypt, while decreased in all metropolitan governorates. We have what we call it caloric deficiency. Caloric deficiency, it means if I consume calories less than the caloric requirement, this means I have a deficiency in caloric, which is food insecure. Of course, it's food insecure. So, which I will not talk about. This is the caloric. Yes, caloric, this is not caloric intake, this is caloric deficiency, sorry. This is a percentage of population suffer caloric deficiency. We found that nationally, we have 17% of the population suffer caloric deficiency, compared to 16.3 in 2015. So we have a somewhat increase in the caloric deficiency between 2015 and 2018. In 2018, the majority among poor people, 33% compared to 99% among non-poor, they have caloric deficiency. So we have 1/3 of poor people suffer from caloric deficiency. The caloric deficiency is highest among the rural Upper Egypt and frontier governorate, and followed by urban governorate. So we have caloric deficiency. If I'm talking about the distribution of population suffering caloric deficiency around regions, we found that 53% of the population suffer caloric deficiency are from rural Upper Egypt. Yani more than half who have or suffer from caloric deficiency, they are in the rural Upper Egypt. And about 20% in urban governorate, followed by rural Lower Egypt. If I'm talking about governorates, we found that 63% of the population in Ina and Aswan suffer from caloric deficiency, and 60% in Suhag and 40% in Fayoum. So we have here, there is a problem of food insecurity in those governorates. This is also by household size. I will not talk about this because I know the time. لا لسه شويتين. Okay.
Yes, 4 minutes.
4 minutes? لا.
3 minutes and a half.
Okay. Finally, I will not talk about this because it depends upon the household size. Of course, when the household size increase, the caloric deficiency also increase. When I'm talking about the education of head, when we talk about the education of head, of course, the education of head affect the caloric deficiency. When I'm talking about illiterate heads, the caloric deficiency will increase. Carry of food security. Which is, as I mentioned, this is a consolidated approach or composite indicator for food security approach by WFP. Carry, it consists of, as I mentioned, by 3 indicators: poverty status, coping strategies, and caloric intake or caloric deficiency. After we calculate the carry, which is a composite indicator, we can classify the population according to this composite indicator, which measure the food insecurity. We decompose the population into 4 categories: totally food secure, they are food secure; marginally food secure; moderately food insecure; and severely food insecure. We found that overall, we have 11.2% of households are food insecure in 2018, with slight difference between 2015 and 2018. Since I'm talking about 11.2 they are food insecure, this means they need permanent strategies to cope with this insufficient food insecurity. If I'm talking about carry by regions, it is the same. I'm talking by the same trend also. We found that households in Upper Egypt are more likely to suffer food insecurity than in any other regions, particularly rural Upper Egypt. We have 23% of households in rural Upper Egypt are food insecure by this carry. Carry, it means I'm combining the three: food poverty and coping strategies and the caloric deficiency. So if we have 1/4 of people in rural Upper Egypt, they are totally food insecure. By given rate, we found the same. We have Aswan, Sohag, and Dina. They have the most food insecure in Egypt. We have 40% and above. We have, like Aswan, we have 45 or 46% in population Aswan. They are food insecure by the carry definition. 18 in Cairo, and we have the minimal طبعا among in lower Egypt. Characteristics, why I say this characteristic, because it affects the inequality. طبعا I'm talking about large household size, they are food insecure, household in rural areas, household who's had with temporary work or outside establishment, or illiterate or having basic education, they are mostly insecure. The last part, which I will go with very quickly, inequality of opportunities in food security. Inequality of opportunities or equality of opportunity. When we talk about equality of opportunity, means that the person's chances in access to adequate food consumption, in order to say equality, the accessibility to food consumption should be unrelated to any circumstances or characteristics. This is what we call it equality. But in reality, this has not happened. Accordingly, the Human Opportunity Index is an instrument that allows us to detect situations of inequality between households. And I can use it to evaluate the progress of any public policy programs at the national or regional levels. We have 4 or 3 opportunities I'm talking about. Poverty status, which household is non-poor. Poverty status, it is an opportunity. Why it's an opportunity? Because it gives the accessibility to food based on the quantity. Because if I'm not non-poor, I have more access to food. So it gives accessibility to food based on the quantity. Sufficiency of energy or energy sufficient to be sufficient, it gives the accessibility to food based on the quality or diversity. Coping strategies, it means I do not adopt any coping strategies for food insecurity. Aggregate for those 3, which is a carry, this is the last opportunity, it is the aggregate opportunity. And those are the circumstances, characteristics of the household, which is used to measure the inequality of opportunities. We have the regions, of course, and the residents, and all characteristics of the head, and some number of children and number of elderly, and so on, some characteristics in the household to measure how much these characteristics affect the inequality of opportunities or the accessibility to food security. This is a Human Opportunity Index by residents. We found that better opportunities in urban areas, in all food security opportunities. On average, accessibility to food based on quantity basis, which is poverty, is a sector with the largest urban-rural gap. We have 15 points gap between urban and rural in the non-poor or in the poverty opportunity. For all opportunities, rural areas offer more restricted access with more inequality of opportunity. Aggregate opportunity, which is the last one in the upper, aggregate opportunity for total Egypt reached 52 points. What do we mean by this? And here we have 52 points, the blue color, 52 points. 52 points, it means we have only 52% of all opportunities to food accessibility are available and allocated equitably. This is only. If we decompose between urban and rural, there's a difference between urban and rural. So we can decompose the difference between urban and rural according to the accessibility, it is the coverage, or equality of opportunities, or according to the circumstances or the characteristics of household. We found that urban areas availed more services than rural areas because the urban-rural gap, we have always, in all opportunities, the human opportunity index for the urban is more than the rural. Urban-rural difference is mainly due to the scale effect, which is very important. It means the change in the average rate in urban and rural areas. Change in food accessibility in urban and rural areas, not in the same rate, while the inequality, if I leave the inequality maintaining the same, we have always the coverage between urban and rural is different. This is also by regions. Here the difference between lower and upper Egypt, we found that there is a difference between lower and upper Egypt, always lower. The human opportunity index in the lower Egypt is always greater than the upper Egypt, and it is the highest على فكرة. Always lower Egypt is the highest in food accessibility than the metropolitan, than the rural areas. And this is the other between metropolitan and upper Egypt. We found that overall we have 73% of the regional gap is explained always by the coverage. The coverage of the food accessibility is always higher in the metropolitan, in the lower Egypt than the urban. Policy recommendation, this is the last slide. Policy recommendation from the findings, we found that the composition of the difference between human opportunity index showed the scale effect due to the overall coverage of opportunities is the dominant effect. Always the scale effect is the dominant. Accordingly, public authorities are indeed expected to play more vital role in the process of increasing the overall coverage. So I need to increase the coverage of opportunities of food accessibility. The second, household in urban areas are always higher ability to access food based on equal opportunity principle than those in rural areas. Therefore, balanced public programs are called in order to decrease the gap between urban and rural. We have to revise targeting. This is very important. We have to revise targeting designs within each sector in order to remove the barriers and to improve equality of opportunities, because we always have inequality of opportunities due to some circumstances. So I have to revise the targeting process. An agenda for reforming expensive and inequitable subsidies for food clearly are justified in order to promote also equality of opportunities. And finally, more equitable policies for human development is needed. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dina, for a very detailed and rich presentation with numbers. I'm going to ask the audience to remember every single number on this presentation. It's really very enlightening to see to the extent of inequality of opportunity in a lot of dimensions, and the extent to which poverty in its different facets and formats have increased through the past 2 decades. And actually, I'm very delighted that this presentation complements very much your talk about the effect of the household being from the agricultural workforce and its implication on the future prospects of the second generation. We have 20 minutes for questions, so I'll do 2 rounds of questions, 3 questions each round, and I'll please ask the person asking the question to identify himself or herself. And we have somebody to help with the mics, do we? Yes, so Heba. So we'll start with a young lady, Dr. Ali, and Ragi.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Maha Mustafa, and I'm an assistant professor at the American and Canadian University. According to Dr. Francesco, I'm not sure if I understood exactly, but I think you mentioned that in Egypt they cannot find jobs in the blue collar, and they are able to find jobs in the white collar. So according to the numbers, we believe that there is more unemployment among the, very high unemployment among the educated people, according to the illiterate people. And the numbers go up to 47% among the people with university degrees and 3.7% of unemployment among the illiterate. So how did you have these findings? And for Dr. Dina, this was an amazing presentation, and it it emphasizes the fact that with steady increase in poverty rates in Egypt, then this indicates that there is a huge loss of inclusiveness and development, despite the figures that we are seeing every day with the steady economic growth figures. So, and of course, there is also very high neglect in Upper Egypt and the rural areas. And I think what you missed in the recommendation, the emphasis on the huge population crisis problem. This is absolutely not tackled on the agenda by the government, and most of the problems boil or they lie down this crisis. So what is your analysis with the increase in economic growth rates and the huge reduction in the developmental rates and the loss of inclusiveness according to these poverty rates? Thank you.
Dr. Ali and then Dr. Ragi.
Ali Aouni, American University in Cairo. You've mentioned there is a dearth of information or research around social mobility in Egypt. This is true, but there is a recent book by Dr. Amani Andil on exactly the same topic. It's in Arabic, unfortunately. Now, if your co-author and Adnan speak Arabic, I will actually pass the link of the book if you're interested. Now, when you talk about, there are hundreds of studies in the US that shows that there is a relation between where you live and your health, your potential employment. I mean, there is a recent study, a professor in Harvard Business School, Raj Shetty, who did a big data. He actually analyzed 40 million, and he found that there is a relation between your zip code and your social mobility. He did a very similar study like yours. So this is everywhere. Now, the interesting part, when you tell me education is the solution, I'll tell you, interesting enough, that there is also studies that shows that where you went to school or to university has a direct implication in your salary. When you talk about inequality, it seeps into everything, including the education itself. So education is inequitable. The guy who goes to an Ivy League or an Oxford or a Cambridge does not earn the same salary as a guy who goes to a community college. It's a fact. Okay. So unless, and Finland had a solution for this, by the way. Education in Finland is public. There are no private schooling. That's 100% interference by the, so, okay. I'm interested in a solution. I mean, I can see your point, and it's everywhere. It's happening everywhere, not just in Egypt. Now, this is one. Now, one quick question to Dr. Dina. Nutrition, calorie is interesting, but nutrition is more important, right? I mean, people would actually bulge on bread and junk food to rise their caloric intake. That does not mean nutrition. And I bet you, if you do nutrition, you're going to find that it's much widespread, including even some what you call middle class, because the way we eat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Dr. Ragi.
Ragi Asad from the University of Minnesota. Again, I have a question for Professor Pastore, and I want to come back to your recommendation about education being the solution to increase social mobility. Some studies have shown that there is considerable intergenerational mobility in education, but that has not translated into intergenerational mobility in occupation. That occupational mobility has been much more rigid and resistant than educational mobility. And it used to be that education played the role when public sector jobs were available, and therefore educational credential translated into social mobility. But as the private sector becomes the dominant employer, we find that the social class, your social class actually mediates the relationship between education and occupational mobility. What the education of your father becomes much more important than your own education. And so that even if you're higher educated, but your father is not, you get much worse outcome than somebody who's higher educated and their father is also higher educated. So I think the private sector is using social class as a marker of quality of labor much more than the public sector ever used to do that. And that kind of limits the role of education in social mobility.
Thank you. So we'll. Do you want to answer now or take another round? Pastore.
You can answer.
You can. Okay. So let's. So there was a question to you first from Dr. Dina.
Well, intellectual, they are actually quite related questions. The intellectual unemployment is also due to the fact that the private sector is not providing enough jobs, I think, in Egypt, and this is the problem. And I don't know whether this is due to white-collar jobs. So it's, I think that the main problem of intellectual unemployment is that the private sector is very weak, and people searched for jobs mainly in the public sector. I agree about the other two questions were very similar. No, education is not the only channel through which you can promote social mobility. I totally agree with that, but probably I was trying to say that it is, of course, it's also a matter of the economic structure. So again, it's the private sector probably that is lacking in Egypt and other countries. A strong private sector able to hire people and to make social mobility from the demand side. So it's the demand side is lacking, I think, is the main factor. I already mentioned this, but of course we look also at the supply side policies that we can implement, which are more control factor, because usually we think that the demand side is less control factor. Egypt is trying to promote growth with the construction industry, building industry, infrastructural industry, but this is not enough to promote industrial development. So again, you know, so from the demand side, it's always very tricky to find the right policy to promote economic growth, structural change, and also social mobility. So that's why we look especially at the supply side. I know that supply side is, of course, not enough, is never enough. But if we want to look also at the demand side, the supply side, of course, we also look at the education. My point was not so much about education itself, if you noted my comments, but the type of education, quality of education, I would say also. So I didn't say that we need more education. I didn't say that. I didn't say we need more education. I said we need that the educational system is able to transfer also soft skills, which are something special. It's something that, generally speaking, educational institutions not consider to be in their mission. And again, also for the higher education, I did not suggest to have more people with a university degree, but to have people that have work-related competencies, that people that have developed the ability to work, not only to study and to be knowledgeable, but also to be competent, which is very different from being more educated, right? So, I mean, that's my, maybe, I don't know, probably I was not clear myself enough. I mean, it's more like the quality, about the quality of education rather than, and the type of education rather than education itself. And of course, it's not only education. We always think of education, but also a better mix with the production system I was mentioning. You know, it is important to generate work-related competencies. I don't know if you agree with me.
Thank you. Dr. Dina?
For the poverty and the gross rate or the development. Poverty is not, in order to measure poverty or in order to say poverty increase from one year to the other year, we have many topics affect this poverty. We have what we call it the education. Education affect poverty. The employment in Egypt also is affect poverty. If I'm talking about the health, also affect poverty. How many, the private sector, if they are make projects and the NGOs make projects to decrease poverty or not. So we have many many circumstances or whatever, we have many parts affecting poverty. So when we talk about that, the poverty increase steadily from 2000 or 1999 to 2018, because we have deteriorated in the education sector, we have deterioration also in the employment sector. We have many things affecting poverty. When we talk about the development, we also the growth rate is measured only by the GDP. So this is, they are not the same way. In order to decrease poverty, we have to play on all these sectors. We have to play on this education, and we have to play in the health sector, and we have in the employment. We have to play also in subsidies. We have to control increasing in the prices. So we have many sectors we have to apply on it in order to decrease poverty. That's what happened in the rural areas. Or in the Upper Egypt. In the Upper Egypt, if you look at the Upper Egypt, you found that the poverty decreased from 2015 to 2018. Why? Because we have many projects already done by the NGOs and the private sector in Upper Egypt. On the other way, we found that, for example, the poverty increase in Cairo or in the metropolitan. That's why we say that poverty is not controlled by GDP only. No, we have many sectors play in order to control poverty. We have to play on all these sectors. So I cannot say that's only I'm talking about only the development, so I will decrease poverty. No, I have to work on education, I have to work on health, I have to work in subsidies to make more better targeting in food subsidies or in energy subsidies. All this I have to work on all these sectors. This is for the poverty. That's why poverty increase from one year to the other. For the nutrition and the caloric intake, you are right. I'm talking about here caloric intake. Caloric intake, in order to calculate caloric intake, I calculated from all food consumed by the household, which takes into account all foods consumed. Maybe junk food, as you mentioned, maybe in all the food. I already calculated also that the nutrition, how much calories from the carbohydrates, how much calories from the protein, and like this. That's what you ask about it. But it gives almost the same trend. When we talk about caloric intake as a whole, as a caloric intake, and when we classify it according to the proteins and carbohydrates and like this, it almost gives the same trends.
Thank you. I'll take another round of questions. I'll ask people who ask questions to be very brief. Here and here, and the gentleman in the back asked. Okay.
So this is for Dr. Dina. My name is Vladimir Hlasny, so my question is about the big rise in poverty between 2015 2018. One factor that you haven't mentioned, but I think it might be important, is the price of food. There was the November 2016 devaluation, and Shireen Al-Azawi and I have studied the pass-through of this devaluation to different commodities and different regions in Egypt, and the food prices are the most sensitive, among the most sensitive to this devaluation, and Upper Egypt is, I think, the most sensitive region there. For me, maybe it's not the demographics of individual households, but the just cross-regional effect that could be a big factor. In relation to what demographic factors might be explaining which households would be in poverty, which not, maybe I would be interested in distinguishing which households rely on formal markets for food. Either they're exporting food, or they're selling food in markets, or they're buying food in the market, versus households that are not connected to markets and just produce food for their own consumption.
Thank you. Question here.
Hi, my name is Silvia Dal Bianco. I'm from UCL London. I have one question for Dr. Pastore. That is, how did you do your propensity score matching which variables did you considered? Because maybe you might have considered something more on the internet-related skills to consider something that might be useful for getting better jobs. And for Dr. Dina, thanks a lot for the amazing presentation. I'm wondering if you have a panel data set, so maybe you can consider a longitudinal measurement for poverty to see if poverty, I don't think so, if it's just a temporary condition or not, because this might provide you with better policy suggestions in terms of whether it's better to borrow to people or it's better to do something else, not to discourage them for working reasons.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back, last question.
Concerning social mobility in Jordan, the agricultural labor jobs are done by Egyptians, and a lot of the catering and restaurant jobs are done by Egyptians, and the textile factories are full of South Asians. So how is this affecting social mobility for Jordanians?
Okay, thank you. We'll start by you again. A couple of questions, one on the Jordanian workspace and one a technical question.
Jordan, honestly, I don't know the situation in Jordan, and I will take this as something to look at more carefully, honestly. Thank you for suggesting this, this link. And also, we did not use the internet skills, but actually it's a very interesting topic. I have to check whether there is any information about this, because I think it may be, especially nowadays, very important to explain social mobility. So,
Dr. Dina.
Yes. That's why I'm saying that poverty is affected by many things. One of these things is the prices and also the devaluation. So that's why, since the prices increase by the rate of inflation is very high between 2015 and 2018, it affects greatly the poverty. And poverty increase, the highest increase in poverty is between 2015 and 2018 because of the devaluation and the increase in the prices. For household who consume their own production, or household they sell or buying from the market, all this is taken into account when calculating the poverty. All this, because when we say household is consuming the own produced components or own producing food, they aggregate all this in their consumption. They measure this own production by how much money if they are selling from buying from outside from the market. So all this is taken into account when calculating poverty. So this is taken into account. The other, for the panel data, this is a very good idea, Taman. Of course, I'm agreeing for this idea, but it needs an in-depth analysis in order to make the panel. We already have in the HIECS panel data, which is very rich, and of course, it's very rich in HIECS. We have in 2017-18, we begin a new panel data, and we'll complete it in the next HIECS. So we can make this human opportunity index for in-depth analysis for the panel data, which is a good idea. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time. Before we end, it was a very intense session in terms of empirical evidence and evidence that is based on data, based on two very important surveys that we use in Egypt, the ELMPS, Egyptian Labor Force Survey, and the HICS, the Household Income Expenditure and Consumption Survey. Both of them are actually led by Dr. Ragi Asad, who was not the HICS, the ELMPS. So thank you so much.